The Choices She Made. Written and read by Hugh Carr. Bria Alwyn stood on the high trestle bridge in the dark. She wore black from head to toe. In particular, she wore a black hoodie so she could pull it down over her face. She wanted nothing to be seen, at least until it was too late. She knew the time of the oncoming train. The whole plan had been devised 2 days before, so that nothing could go wrong. Once she walked out onto that bridge, it had to be a one-way journey. She had rejected razor blades, tablets, and jumping from high places. Each of those held the danger of being an action that she could reflect upon, if only for seconds. Seconds were enough to stop the blade biting. After swallowing the tablets, the seconds before unconsciousness and the oblivion might last an eternity. In this choice, if she stood her ground, there would be no doubt, no time to panic or regret the choice. A distant horn sounded. If it had come out of a thick fog, it could have been confused for some ancient beast. But blaring out from behind the backs of houses that she had known all her life, there were no illusions or daydreams to disguise that it was a heavy freight train hurtling towards the space on which she stood. A short time later, and she saw the light round the houses to the right of her vision. She gripped the hood, pulling it down over her pale face and adopting a crouching position on the track. Here, in the middle of the high trestle bridge, there was no chance of waiting on the sidelines behind cover and then jumping out at the last second. Yet it also had the advantage of committing her to the act. If she suddenly had a change of heart, there was 500 feet to run before she reached the point where she could jump off. And in the middle of the bridge where she now stood, the fall to the creek below was almost 200 feet. Bria wasn't thinking of escape, though. Everything that had led her to this place was behind her in the dark of her life that was soon to be no more. Ahead of her was only a growing light. As it came close, she felt as if it were warming her skin. Then the bridge began to shake as the unstoppable train closed off her last chance for retreat. The darkness she had wrapped herself in had worked. Too late the driver saw a small dark shape. At first his fear was that it was an animal on the track. He tugged at the horn. The shape did not move. As he applied the brakes, he realized with horror that the shape was undoubtedly a person. Bria heard the banshee scream of brakes, but felt with rising hope that there was no way the momentum could stop the train from turning her into a cloud of red stars. Squealing, shuddering, she wondered if she could in fact hear the driver's scream of terror and despair above it all. 20 feet. 10 feet. 5. 1. The scream stopped. All sound ceased. Bria listened.
"Is this really what you want?"
came a quiet voice from behind her. Bria opened her eyes, startled. There before her was the cyclopean Belarus eye of the train's light, beaming through a mist of propelled dust and gravel. But it did not move. Each particle remained as fixed as a photograph. She turned to look behind. An orange cloth camp chair was positioned 10 feet behind her. Next to it was a small picnic table with a top that was almost but not quite the same shade of orange. On it sat a thermos, a plastic coffee cup, and a plate of what looked like chocolate digestives. A hand reached out and took one of the biscuits and the coffee cup and brought it to the faintly smiling mouth of the thin, elderly man who sat in the camp chair. He dunked his biscuit several times in the coffee and then frowned.
"Blast," he scowled. "I hate it when the biscuit does that. It broke off in my coffee."
Bria shook her head. She whirled around again, looking back at the frozen train. It hadn't moved one iota. She was astonished for the first few moments, but as the seconds seemed, for her at least, to pass by, that astonishment gave way to a rage unlike any she had ever felt before.
"Did you do this?"
she accused, pointing her finger savagely at the supine train.
"Do what?"
the man asked, as he fished the sodden, floating islands of biscuit out of his hot drink. She grasped at her throat in frustration.
"Stop the train! Did you make it stop?"
The old man scowled.
"Do I look like I could stop a train?"
Beneath his wild, white eyebrows, his eyes were small, sunken, and grey. They looked at her as if the question was the most natural in the world, and her interrogating him was as foolish as asking a fish if it liked water. For a moment, it looked as if Bria was fixed in time as well. She stood still and glared. The man merely sipped at his coffee.
"I think a much more pertinent question is why are you and I here, and only one of us has the comfort of coffee?"
He extended his long and bony hand to indicate a second mug, which she hadn't before seen. Bria stepped forward and then swept the mug away into the darkness with a violent swipe. The man sighed and then said in a slightly aggrieved tone,
"It was your favorite blend, you know."
"Who the hell are you?" Bria screamed, infuriated by his calmness in this, the most painful, the most confusing, the most terminal moment of her life.
"Who the hell am I?"
The man laughed in return, seemingly oblivious to her very real desire to pitch him bodily off the side of the bridge. He chuckled at her words.
"Hell, yes, funny and applicable. If there were such a thing as Hades, or perhaps the wonderful hell of the Norse sagas, then that would be very, very fitting. But as to who am I, do you know, I don't really know. And though you may find this surprising, I've never really stopped to wonder. I just am."
Bria had fixed both of her hands over her mouth and nose. She had to do something with them. The determination she had put into suicide was now mutating into an unexpected compulsion to wring his scrawny neck. "Your name is Am?" she said dully. He mused at her question. Then he smiled brightly.
"All right, then. If names are important, I am Ego. And you are Bria May Olwen, I see. That I know. What I don't know is why this is the place you choose to end your life."
The question took away her breath. Up to that moment, she hadn't been aware of whether she was breathing. Right before the train was upon her, she had felt all the throbbing ache of why she had chosen this place and this way to die was at last melting into oblivion in the dark. Now, with his question, the pain came starkly back. She choked, and immediately the man in his chair became misted in her tears. She flung her fingers over her eyes, unable to stop the hot streams that flowed from them. She sank to her knees. But they didn't touch gravel. Beneath them she felt the softness of grass. She opened her eyes. She was kneeling in bright daylight on the steep grassy slope that climbed up eventually to the trestle bridge. She was no longer in black. Her legs were covered in purple jeans, and a soft pink blouse hung from her shoulders. And she wasn't alone. Sitting alongside of her and staring off into the distance was a handsome teenage boy. "Dylan?" she said. To her, her voice sounded strangled. Dylan didn't seem to notice. He turned back to look at her with that broad, gleaming smile she adored. Didn't he see her tears? "Are you sure you still want to?" he said. Although his tone was serious, his face never lost its ever-present smile. It wasn't the same smile she had seen 3 months ago. It wasn't the same Dylan. Dylan was 24 now and sported a waxed mustache and a goatee. This was a Dylan of summer holidays when she was 15, and used to lie in her bed, hugging her pillow and smiling with sweet agony as she imagined it was him, tight against her small breasts. Although she heard a voice and turned to face it, Dylan seemed oblivious. Beside her, the old man stood and looked down on her and Dylan. But he wasn't an old man any longer. Now he seemed closer to her age. His face was youthful, perhaps that of a 19-year-old young man, but his expression was one that gave an unsettling age to his smooth features. "I see," he said softly. "I'd wondered why you would choose to die here. You're hardly more than a stone's throw or two from your childhood home. When the train hits you, you'll be smashed apart. But still, your family and your neighbors will always know you died just nearby. A horrible, messy death. Not horrible for you so much, as it'll be fast and you won't feel it. But it will certainly be horrible for the driver and the people who have to pick up the pieces. And the police. They'll look at the photos your mother will give them of a smiling, very pretty dark-haired girl with grey-green eyes, and they will agonize over why such a face, so full of intelligence and hope, staring into the camera as if she can see only a bright future filled with possibilities, why she chose such a violent, destructive end. They will look at that picture and the pictures of your remains and be forever haunted. You won't know any more about it, but they will have to live with it all their lives." "Do you want me to feel guilty?" Bria hissed. The man did not answer. Instead, Dylan's face creased. "No, I just wanted to make sure we're still going to do it. I won't want to if you don't want to. It's okay, we can do anything else." Suddenly, it fell into place. She knew when this was. Dylan and she had grown up in the same neighborhood, always punctuated by the noisy passage of the freight train crossing the bridge. Each of them had said, half-jokingly to the other, that one day they would play chicken on it. Then one day, in the last week of term, Dylan told her he was going to do it, really do it, and she knew that he would. At first she tried to talk him out of it. She loved him even then, but it was a simple schoolgirl love, made up of mostly being giddy in his presence. The first step towards real love was realizing he might cock it up and get himself hurt. So she had insisted on doing it too. They didn't tell anyone else. It was their secret, and she enjoyed the thrill that she and he had something private that no one else would know. That had sustained her right up to the day that they had set out to do it. It was this day. They were only seconds away from the moment. Yes, he had reached out his hand just like he was doing now. She had clasped it, and it felt just like it did now, warm and full of electricity that shot up her arm, struck her heart, and radiated lower down so that she did not know if she might wet herself or dance. They were running together now. Half of her remembered it as it had been. The other was free to feel it, like she never had before. She knew what was coming. There had been the expectation, the clutching tightly of his hand, the freedom to hug his side when the train rounded the bend and came into sight. There was the flush of hopeless terror and the sense that she and he had set themselves against a very, very dangerous and stupid thing that might blindly race up behind them with impossible speed and bury them beneath crushing, slicing steel. With that terror filling them, they had both turned and run. Their hands had broken free. There was the ever-present fear that they might trip and fall. Yet through it all, Bria knew what would happen. She knew what came afterwards. So she followed him again. She turned and looked back to see how close the strange young man was. Ego was nowhere to be seen. They came and stood on the bridge together. The sun was warm. The gravel smelled of tar and iron. The creek rushed loudly in the gully far, far below them. The horn of the train sounded. Around the dusty line of rooftops to their right, a low, dark worm rounded. In the heat, its form wavered and wiggled. When they were sure that it was on the straight stretch, heading directly for them, they both burst with a scream that was half a laugh and began to run. Dylan was fast. He raced ahead, yet every few moments he stopped, half-turned, and cried on his encouragement. In the last 50 feet she reached him, and he held out his hand. She clung to it. She half ran and was half dragged by him. They hurtled along together as the horn sounded again and again behind them, and, laughing almost to the point of tears and with hardly any remaining breath, they made the grassy slope on the far side with time to spare. Both of them leapt off the bridge together and collided with the slope, rolling over and over each other. That was when it happened. They laughed so much that Bria saw spots before her eyes. She knew what was going to happen now. She savored every second of it. This was how she discovered it was not a dream. They had hugged each other in delight of their bravery and their silliness, of the secret that they had shared, and the fact that they had no idea of the thrill the fear would bring them. The hug had faltered, and they were left staring at each other, no longer laughing. As she had before, Bria instigated it. She plunged into him and kissed him fully on his mouth. The only difference was that it was not a kiss of nervousness and inexperience. She made the most of it. She felt every line of the press of those lips. Her tongue slipped unashamedly into his mouth, and she gasped with the pleasure of receiving his as well. This was different. Before, the kiss had been short and full of misdirection. This time, Bria fought to shape him into a man. She felt it all. Until the voice that was suddenly old again whispered at her ear.
Then why did it go from this to this?
She was holding Dylan still, but he was breaking away. There had been no kiss in this moment. She felt the tears she had been crying cold on her cheeks. Before her was the Dylan she now knew. He was moving away from her, angry and deaf to her tears. This had been only 3 months ago. The wound of it that had ached until the moment she had stood in the dark, awaiting the oncoming train, was first reopened and then stabbed again. It was the night that he had told her there was someone else. He had chosen a reunion of their school friends to do it. And when she had gone inside the restaurant, her makeup smeared with her tears, she had not received comfort from her friends. Instead, they had treated her like she was a fool. Did she know it was obvious that Dylan was really seeing Emily? Hadn't she seen how Emily looked tonight? What did she expect? Everyone knew that Emily belonged with Dylan. They were so suited. Take it easy. Get a grip. And then 2 weeks later, she'd been fired. She had tried so hard to get work at another clinic. Many were sympathetic, but there just weren't any jobs going at the moment. The agency she went to couldn't get her back into another veterinary nurse position, but they could offer her a job in a call center until she could get back into it. Fewer and fewer of her friends called to see how she was. On Facebook, she discovered she'd been blocked by at least 3. Her life began to consist of getting up, going to the call center, coming home and sleeping. Every morning it seemed a little bit harder to get up. The call center work only just covered her costs. 2 weeks into the contract, she was told she wasn't meeting the quotas, and the job was withdrawn. All the agency could offer was another call center. This one was further away and slightly lower in pay. 2 days into that job, she was abused by a client she had called so hurtfully that she dropped the phone. Before she knew what she was doing, she had wandered outside of the building and was staring blindly at the trams that rumbled by on the main street. Everything was blurred. Everything was empty of sound and light. How easy it would be to just walk in front of those trams and not know anything more. She had shuffled slowly towards them.
"And what stopped you then?"
Ego asked.
"Why didn't you walk in front of that tram?"
Why didn't I? She wondered. What had brought her back from that decision? It was the thought that there was still strength left. No matter how tired and confused and lonely she felt, there was still strength to be found. Nothing can be that bad. There was nothing that made turning away from life and walking into oblivion really like a good choice. After all, she might not be happy in the moment, but there was always the potential happiness of another day, another time. To die was to not even have sadness, or fear, or loneliness. It was to be really and totally nothing. Nothing. No thought, no feeling, no wonder if anyone was missing you, if the world was darker without you in it. It was the great null. No Bria, no friends, no world, no time. Where they stood now, Bria didn't know. Ego was only a few feet from her. Although they were surrounded by darkness, he seemed to be illuminated somewhere from above, so that his eye sockets were turned into deep holes. All the wrinkles and loose skin of his face were sharply defined.
"Dark, isn't it?"
he said simply, and gestured, indicating the emptiness around them.
"It's so dark that you can't see anything, can you? It isn't like where we were before, but has it ever been really as dark as this, do you think?"
Before she could answer, she noticed something moving to the right of her. No, not movement. A light. Somewhere in the dark, far away, there was a light. As she watched it, it was slowly, ever so slowly, coming closer. Walking out that day had lost her the job. Very soon, the agency stopped setting up interviews. Her parents invited her one night to dinner, and after only a short time she was sobbing, telling them she couldn't pay her bills. A day later, her mother offered that she could move back into her old room. Her dad was using it as a study for now, but they could put her old bed back in there and she could stay as long as she wanted, until she got back on her feet again. She had moved back. When she had walked through the front screen door, she had seen the familiar cobalt blue of the front hall. Her mother had always complained about the shade. It was supposed to be peacock blue, and wouldn't be until her father had applied an upper coat to correct the hue, something he hadn't done in 27 years, and, Bria suspected, never would. The first thing her mother said was to highlight what a simple glance could already detect. It was still the wrong shade of blue. She then proceeded to apologize in advance for everything that was wrong with the house still, down to the most minute detail. Bria remembered why she had been so desperate to move out in the first place. However, in the space filled by her absence, her mother's mild irritation at her father's inability to arrange and organize the house as she expected had grown from exasperation to what appeared to be full-blown contempt. Every conversation she had seen them engage in was replete with snide remarks and references to past failures. It was not long before Bria discovered the invitation to stay from her mother had not been made in consultation with her father. Bereft now of a place to build his model ships, he had fallen into a sullen silence that was broken only by 3 phrases. "Where's the remote?" "What's for dinner?" and "Please don't leave the side gate open or the dog will get out again." Her isolation from those she had called friends became complete. She was alone in her childhood room, unsleeping and haunted by the hatred that had grown between her parents, that her presence did not calm or soothe, only brought it into sharper focus. 3 days before, she had returned back to the cold house, tired from another day of fruitless job hunting. She had been so tired that she did not remember to close and lock the side gate. Max, her father's young border collie pup, had escaped while she slept, dead to the world. She awoke to her father's tearful shouting in the kitchen and the sound of her mother desperately trying to stop him from storming into the room, dragging her out of bed and berating her for Max's death, hit by a car.
"She's got to go,"
she heard him cry, his voice shaking. Over and over again in the night she said, "I'll go, all right." Each loss was a retreat from her freedom. It was a retreat from self-respect. It was a retreat from hope. She had retreated far back to the place she had started, to the neighborhood she had once shared with Dylan. He had moved on, full of hope. She had nowhere else to retreat to. Somewhere in the shadows, Bria caught faint glances of people shuffling. Some disappeared deep into the gloom the moment she spotted them. Others came and stood just outside of the light that illuminated Ego and her. Each one of them had faces striped with tears. Their faces were etched with their grief, as if they knew nothing else. Despair had paralyzed all other recollections. Was Ego creating this for her to see? Was he some type of... She shook her head in disbelief at this thought. Some type of spectre that came to gloat on her grief. Or was there a reason for what she was seeing by his side? "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Are you taking me to the other side?"
"The other side?"
Ego repeated, in a voice that bordered on mockery.
"What other side? When have you seen anything that looks like another side? There is only life and the end of it. Who you are, who anyone is a thing that reacts, is shaped by, and shapes life. So you think there's another side to it all, do you? And do you think that beetles will be there too? And worms? And bacteria that were the masters of this earth for so many millions of years that their tiny discarded bodies make up the majority of all life that has ever been? Do they get an afterlife too? No, there is nothing after life. Afterlife is death. When the train hits you, you will be scattered into chunks. Not all of them will be found. Those that are left behind, that are not feasted on and end up in the guts of rats and carrion birds, will rot in the dirt until the grass around turns fetid and moulds form. But in those moulds, you will be the host to a whole new and tiny cosmos of life, so there is no end. Do you want to live on knowing that? Do you want to see your flesh blister with green and grey, and smell the decay of rotting flesh, and know that is truly you? Is that the afterlife you want?
As Ego said these words, he stepped towards her, his features umbered and blackened. No longer was he the old man with the sharp face. Now the life that grew on the dead curled and spiraled out of his flesh, like someone was pressing putty through a mold, or meat through a mangle. Bria backed away aimlessly into the dark. He followed her. Now he was only an outline in the darkness.
"What do you want from me?"
she screamed at him. "Look," came his voice. "I want you to look and see as I see. Tell me this life is worth destroying, and I will let you be nothing." The darkness lifted. She was standing in a room that was encircled with young women standing almost shoulder to shoulder. The walls hung with delicate chiffon and ribbons, their pastel colors lit by strands of warm-toned fairy lights. In the center of the room, a ring of tiny preschool girls were sitting on cushions made to resemble toadstools, and at the head of the ring sat a woman with a wide, loving smile, dressed pixie fashion with exquisitely made dragonfly wings. In her hand she held a wand with a trailing silver tassel, and on her head was a circle of silver. "And what do you wish for?" she was asking one of the little girls with a laughing voice.
"A big girl bicycle,"
the little girl replied, her eyes shining.
"I'm a big girl."
The women gathered, chorused a drawn-out "Aww," until the pixie-dressed woman raised her wand and patted the girl on the head.
"Fairies, fairies of the forest," the woman chanted softly, "help Eleanor's wish to come true." "And what's your name?" she asked the girl seated beside Eleanor.
"Georgina?"
the little girl cried, gleeful at her turn to gain her wish.
"And what would you wish for?"
the woman asked again, grinning. Georgina clasped her fat little fingers together and thought, licking her lips.
"Glow shoes and a crazy straw."
Again the woman laughed softly and encouragingly. Georgina had grasped the principle of in for a penny, in for a pound. Her mother smiled and dreamed of her daughter's financial success. Patiently, the pretend pixie again raised her wand and patted Georgina on her golden curls.
"Fairies, fairies of the forest, help Georgina's wish to come true."
Around the circle it went. The little girls began to play one-up, seeking ever-increasing levels of riches. Rooms full of dolls were ordered, enough cake and sweets to fill everyone assembled to the point of sickness. Bria began to tire of the indulgences the girls were encouraged with, the cooing of their mothers, and the sly looks they cast when the less popular children tried and failed to compete in demanding the most envied possessions.
"And what's your name?"
the pixie asked a little girl who was staring at the decorations on the ceiling. Bria hardly noticed her. Then the little girl replied.
"Bria,"
she said. At age 4, She had not yet mastered her name. Bria suddenly turned and saw her tiny self. Suddenly the memory of the party began to filter back. She had not recognized it. When she had been that tiny girl with tiny black shoes and powder blue leggings and a brooch of gold and peacock blue stone on her tiny white cardigan that she knew was her mother's favorite, the room had seemed so large. Little Bria looked with a slightly dazed expression, half of awe at the pretty pixie. Her hands were folded together beneath her chin. She paused. No demands for ponies or chocolates or a dozen new dresses came to her little cherubic lips. She knew that something was expected of her. Bria remembered. With a drowning wave, the memory of that moment came back to her. She knew what her tiny self would say. She looked on that little face, so innocent and so unknowing of bitterness, and the hatred of bitterness, and felt the tears flowing uncontrollably. The pixie raised her eyebrows and smiled encouragingly at her little self. "You can ask for anything, Bria," she said sweetly.
"Stars,"
little Bria said. The room melted. There was a flush and tide that washed through all the women there, drowning out what avarice and jealousy that each had boiling in their cores. For one moment, Bria changed them all. Bria wanted to hold that small self. She reached out and tried to push through the women who seemed to rush forward. The ring was closing in. The innocent eyes of her small self looked up and vanished from her sight. "No," she cried out. "Bring her back. Bring her back. I want her back. I want her." Each word was said with an effort, until she was lost in a howl of tears. "You can't have her back," Ego's voice said softly out of the dark. "She is gone, and only you remain. You can't be her again, but she is inside you. Do you want to destroy her when you destroy yourself?" "No," Bria wailed. She fell to her knees and keened. She rocked and lamented, as if only she could wring out the tears that would lament her loss. With what strength remained, she turned towards the voice of Ego. "No, I want her back. I want to go back." More than anything, she knew now what she was set to destroy. "Let me go back." A hand rested softly on her back. "You choose your life," came the voice. "Yes," she cried. Then she answered again, louder. She decided in that moment, unlike any decision that her life had ever offered, that she would choose life. "Yes, I mean it. I want to live." Although everything was dark, Ego stood clear and alone. Through her tears, Bria could see he was young again, even younger than before. He was little more than a child. "I believe you," he said. "I give you back your life. Go back." He faded. Before he disappeared entirely, she caught his parting words. "Oh, the biscuit is broken off again. Why does this always happen to me?" For a short time, the darkness remained. Bria wiped the salt and wetness from her eyes, which were burning and sore from the volume of her tears, but somehow her face felt fresh. It felt alive. She was alive, yet she was still in the dark. She wondered if she should thank Ego for her life. He had given her something she had failed to find in herself. Whatever suffering now came her way, she knew that her life was precious, made more so by the perseverance of suffering. He had asked her to look, and she had seen the essential core of herself, as she believed Ego had seen her, filled with curiosity and a love of wonderment. She had no idea who he was, or indeed if he had been real at all. She had no way of knowing. All she did know was he, or she herself, had brought her back. Why was it still so dark? The stars had been out when she had waited on the track. Bria looked overhead in hope of seeing their light. Stars. Fierce light burst upon her, then sound. She looked into the light and then crouched before it. She had made her choice. In the drawn-out place that lasted between the final seconds of life, she knew that Ego was born from her in the perilous moment her brain ultimately comprehended her death. There was no turning away from the choice she had made. She had only a moment to fold her hands before her face as the horn and the brakes of the train screamed and broke more than the peace of the night. Thank you for listening to The Choices She Made, written and read by Hugh Carr. That's me. This story is particularly special to me, so if you enjoyed it, please leave some comments below, and please share it with your friends, post it on your favorite social media, and tell them what you liked about it. Sound design, editing, and art by Hugh Carr. Forgotten was composed and performed by White Sands. Bria's theme was composed and performed by Hugh Carr. Special thanks to Jill Carr and Eamon Connor. You can listen to Eamon's song Pony Ride and others by clicking the link in the description below. As always, look out for the shadows.
Those that are left behind that are not feasted on and end up in the guts of rats and carrion birds will rot in the dirt. Shooby-gooby.